All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions, and throughout this presentation, I'd like you to raise your hand, and if you're not quite sure, just pick something. It doesn't really matter too much. How many of those are on the red side, so the attackers, the pen testers, that sort of thing? Can I get a show of hands? 4? How many are on the blue side of things? Oh, okay. I was actually expecting a reverse there. So, given that most of the audience is blue, how many think they have a good grasp on how long it takes to actually investigate a red team? How many people reckon it's about 10 hours work for a one-day red team? No? Let's go 100 hours for a one-day red team. A few, okay. All right. The reason I'm up here talking to you guys today is because I found a really big disconnect between what a lot of pen testers think is the time it takes to actually investigate a red team. I found that they thought they ran one Nmap scan and it would hit 255 hosts, and they'd think, oh, that's a couple of minutes work, when in reality it's very different. So what I'm going to go through today is basically, I'm going to go through a red team, and I'm going to go the red team, the blue team, and what you can do on both sides. And then I'm going to go through some of the real issues that are about and that compound the time that it takes to actually decipher what's happened in an engagement like this. And also at a recent Slack conversation on Sec Talks, there wasn't enough good blue team, so this is my attempt, blue team talk, so this is my attempt to actually solve that issue. Now, I've conducted red teams. I've actually been mostly on the other side. I've been defending against red teams, and I've personally had probably about 5 to 7 red teams against myself and the greater team that I work with. And I've picked up some sneaky tricks along the way, and not all of those are mine. But I've also picked up some interesting detection strategies which you may not have thought about. And we're going to go through these in a step-by-step process. So now I wasn't born blue team, all right? It's quite an interesting story, actually. I interviewed for a job at actually CrikeyCon 1. That is a photo of Zane. Where's Zane? Is Zane here? Zane, put your hand up. I know you don't want to. That's a photo of Zane and I at CrikeyCon 1. Now, just to give you an example of how far we've come, look behind me there. That's a tarp over a window. Yep. Taped to the window that someone had to rush out and get because when they put the projector on, there was too much light and no one could see anything. Now, clearly we can now afford colour printing because it's an A3 black and white CrikeyCon behind me there. And that was at the old Polish club at West End there, so that's going back a little bit now. We actually talked about, we scanned all of the IPv4 Australian address space just before G20. This was right around that time, just to see how vulnerable we were. I'm sure you can guess the conclusion to that talk. But that was actually a fairly uneventful G20, if you remember. Not a lot happened, which was quite surprising, but there was a lot of talk in the media that some cyber element may occur, but thankfully we never saw that. Now, my name's Ben Passmore, and I have the blue team blues. As you can see from this photo, I have a lot more grey hair now. I've gone a bit bald, and a bit more power here as well. I need to start some BTA meetings, Blue Team is Anonymous. I need to thank Stacey Gillespie of the JCSC actually for the name to the talk. Now, just before I continue, this is a disclaimer. The learnings from this presentation aren't from one employer, they're actually from a lot of people. I've combined a lot of people's learnings into this presentation, so my opinions are not my employers at the moment. Quick Google will tell you who I work for, but this is not them. So I'm going to step through a red team exercise now, and it's going to be a bit of a scenario. So we're going to have external attackers, and external red team, sorry. Excuse me. And their goal is to get an internal database. All right? They just need to exfiltrate this internal database, that's their flag, and they need to maintain some persistence. So usually the first step is some sort of reconnaissance. This is a form of passive intelligence gathering, and it usually provides the biggest amount of wealth of information in any red team exercise. And this can be from Shodan, Google, Maltego, all those sorts of powerful tools, and to get a lay of the land. And you can find a lot with a bit of Google Kung Fu. So that's usually the first step, and the important word there is passive. From a blue team side, it's like you're playing Where's Waldo, but you actually don't know you're playing Where's Waldo. This is really hard to detect any sort of reconnaissance against any target because it is designed to be passive. The attackers don't actually want you to know that they're looking at you at the moment. But there are some things you can do. Raise of hands how many people know what canary tokens are? A few? Okay, I'll go over it again just for those who don't know. So a canary token is some form of beacon. It can be embedded in a document, which is usually the case, and it can be an image that loads from an external site. And usually all this tells you is that your document was opened in X. It may give you a country, it may give you an IP address, that's about it, but it can just be open. So if you have confidential documents internally that shouldn't be shared externally, they can all contain canary tokens, and all of a sudden you'll be like, why has our document been opened in Kazakhstan? We're an Australian company. So that sort of technique can be used. There's a fair few companies that do this sort of technique, and it's quite good. And you'll see a lot of the marketing people use it for email marketing statistics as well. Now there's another thing though that actually sort of works, fake accounts. These don't always work. This is Ben Jemima. And a lot of the time you can put these up on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever it may be, but to a degree you are actually breaking the terms of service. This is something we have had a lot of success with, okay? Especially LinkedIn. Putting up those fake accounts and you'll get, sometimes you're not quite sure if they're just like your profile picture or if they're actually some sort of attack waiting to happen. But if you look at your proxy logs actually, and you look across your proxy logs, and most of your URLs from most of your social media networks will provide a unique identifier for a profile. If you suddenly see a large portion of your employees look at a single LinkedIn profile, there may be something to it, right? Because usually they just try and bulk friend anyone, and let's be honest, most people looked at LinkedIn at work at some form. So that's one way you can sort of detect the reconnaissance phase, but again, it's a bit. I'm going to remove that slide off the thing now. Yeah, thank you. All right. So the next phase, usually for the red side, is the mapping side of things. All right, they need to actively touch the external infrastructure and figure out what's out there. This can be anything you can imagine. It's a form of active intelligence gathering. You're using Nmap and spidering tools like Burp and those sorts of things. And it's really a way just to gauge their footprint. Now, most big companies have a fairly large footprint, and it's an issue for a lot of people. So let's imagine in this scenario you find about 1,000 hosts. You find they're running Telnet. Who runs Telnet anymore? That's pretty old. But you find they're running SSH and FTP and a whole lot of web servers as well. That's pretty commonplace for any sort of company. From this point, you'd think that the blue team would be able to detect some of this. Well, imagine you're an old grandpa sitting in your house, and this may be a euphemism for me, but I'm sitting there and you hear a knock on the door. All right, you get up, no one's there. You go back to your seat. Another knock at the door. You get up, no one there. All right, this continues over and over and over. This is basically what Nmap's doing against your external network. All right, it's a whole lot of alerts hitting the external facing side of your network, and it's noise. That's all it is, it's noise. You don't know if it's Shodan scanning you, which in some regards is a legitimate service. You don't know if it's an attack. You don't know if it's the Russians or Chinese or whatever it may be. It's noise. It happens a lot. Just go look at your logs. So from here, and one thing I want to talk about later is actually the alert fatigue. That's a very big factor in this sort of thing, so I'll get into that in a little bit. But there's some things you can do. How many people will realise that when you run Nmap by default settings, it actually emits that user agent you can see on the screen there? Okay, most of the pen testers in the room, maybe. But if you look for this, again, and this is pulled off my day job, but this is just an external web server that's been Nmapped, right? It's clear as day it's been Nmapped. It doesn't give me a lot of intelligence. It gives me an IP address, gives me a time. That's really about it. So as a pen tester, really have a look at what sort of signatures your tools emit, because sometimes we can pick them up quite easily. If you're red teaming me, please don't change this. So you've mapped the external network. You've figured out they've got about 1,000 hosts. You've got a fair bit of information out of your reconnaissance phase. It's ready to try and to exploit, to actually traverse inside their network. Low-hanging fruit. You know, we've probably all heard of that term before. You go for the path of least resistance. Telnet's probably that path of least resistance here. Turns out it's not available anymore, which is interesting in itself. When Nmap ran and we ran our mapping phase, it said Telnet was there. Is this a problem with our tools, or is this something that gets switched on, switched off when we're developers in the office or not? It's a ghost. So that's interesting. We go to FTP, SSH, and all those sorts of things, and we try the default passwords, admin password. None of that's working. They all require authentication. Hopefully that's pretty standard for most of us, but we have all been known maybe to have default passwords lying around somewhere. So from there, we can't really, the low-hanging fruit doesn't seem to exist, at least easily. But what we do find is we spend a few hours browsing all the HTTP websites that are exposed. We're looking around and there's nothing really terribly interesting, but we actually stumble across a browsable indexed directory. And for those who don't know what that is, that's just basically a listing of all the files on a web server, and it's been misconfigured or it hasn't been configured. We find a bash script on there, and lo and behold, booyah, it has a username password hard-coded in it. Okay? We try that username and password in the FTP and the SSH, it doesn't work. We'll keep this one for later. We'll put it in our back pocket for now. Interestingly, Google didn't actually find this during our Google Kung Fu reconnaissance phase. So, in regards to this low-hanging fruit, again, with the amount of noise that hits our external services, it's very hard to tell if someone's just poking you, if it's a red team, if it's, again, China or whoever it may be. It's very, very hard, especially the larger the company you get and the more diverse. If I had to action every single time someone scanned our network, I'd need a team of 1,000 guys working 24/7. It just would not happen. So we can't alert on every single instance, and we can't baseline it, because the noise just jumps up and down. It's not a constant noise. It is suddenly we're getting scanned from 500 hosts, suddenly we're getting scanned from none. So there's no pattern to it. AI doesn't work here, people. AI cannot solve that, at least in my opinion. But this browsable index, one way you could actually look for that is literally just scan your own web presences for the word password. You know, do a recursive wget and just do a grep for password. Do this once a month. You know, it may not work for 2 years, 3 years, but when it does, you better raise a red flag. And I have actually seen a company do this before. What I have seen, which is very unfortunate, is domain administrator credentials sit in a Google indexed blog in a bash script for 3 years that were still valid. The red team came along and look what we found in the reconnaissance phase, and they worked. Just because this guy had a blog about cats and thought he'd written this amazing PowerShell script, and unfortunately he'd hard-coded DA creds. So use a bit of Google Kung Fu, scan your own web servers, just have a look at your own infrastructure. Now, there's one thing you can do when it comes to external services, and if you haven't noticed already, I'm taking a bit of a no words on the PowerPoint view, but if you're a red team, you're probably scanning across FTP, SSH, Telnet, and let's say you are actually logging all those authentication failures. If most of the bots out there that are scanning you are focusing on one service, they're focusing on SSH, they're focusing on FTP, and they're hitting you hard. If you have the same IP address, the same user agent, some fact that is consistent across all those services in a narrow time frame, you could consider that maybe that's a more targeted attack versus then some bot that's scripting you. High noise ratio, yes, and if it's coming out of a VPN, that may be difficult, but these are the sort of things you can do to maybe differentiate the the noise from the actual targeted stuff. And if you're a really sneaky attacker, you could randomize all of it, but again, don't do that to me, please. So, we've just said the low-hanging fruit doesn't work. We need to get a little dirty. We need to go to an exploit phase. Usually this turns into basically you'd profile all the services that are running, you'd find their versions, you'd look up the CVE database, you'd find an active exploit. Something that's unpatched, something that you can easily break. And unfortunately, a lot of the red teams, this is where it falls over. We just don't have good assurance and patching in the external side, and they find something to pop. So in this case, it takes a little while, but they find a vulnerable web server, and they are able to get a web shell into an uploads directory of a web server. Now you'll see in the news, there's a lot of people using web shells, there's a lot of nation states using web shells. They're very effective, and they've been around for a long time. I started my career as the guy that wrote the PHP that everyone laughs at today. I wrote those websites. They probably still exist, which horrifies me. And I was always interested in security, but I became the de facto security guy because so many of our websites were getting popped with these web shells. And they're fairly easy to find if you know what you're looking for, but they're very similar to legitimate code. So it's very hard to eradicate them in some cases. Anyway, we've got this web shell in this upload directory, so booyah, we have compromised this company. From a blue team side, what do you reckon we can do? I sound like a bit of a broken record here. The weblogs are noisy. Everyone's scanning us. We can't baseline this information. Well, you can look at some rare events. You can look at post requests. I had an investigation where the web shell's involved. The web servers in question, no one ever posted to that website. It was just a static site. And we were following the attacker who were randomizing their IP addresses based solely on the fact that they were posting or trying to post to this website. So have a look for rare values. The brain is geared to determine patterns. It's very good at doing that. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Also, odd headers and requests. Usually Python developers, if they're using some custom script, they may be default, just like the nmap thing. Python requests, the library actually has a default user agent string, which sits there unless you change it. The other thing you can do is actually file monitoring solutions. Right? If you've got a really tight development process, every time there's a release, you can MD5 all the files and you can watch those files and if they change. Okay? And should one of them ever change in production without a release, there's an alert there. That requires a fair amount of overhead, but can be done. And also, you'd think antivirus scans would be happening on the uploads. I'm sure you've all seen you upload something to OneDrive, Microsoft, Google, and it says, just hang on a sec, I'm antivirus scanning this for you. That's also possible. But in this case, it's an uploads directory, which changes a lot. Some of these things aren't applicable or easy. And to be honest, from an assurance side of things, this just comes down to patching. We all know it. Install your patches and do some asset discovery. There are some companies out there, Shodan, Asset Note, and those sorts of things that you can pay, and they'll show you as much information as you need to know to see your external interfaces. And also, a lot of these web shells also emit signals in your logs. Quick Google will tell you that, and you can scan those through your logs as well. Now, this is where it gets really fun. So you've now got a web shell, you're on the server, you've compromised it, you now need to do another mapping phase. Jackpot, you've hit 20,000 hosts, it's a flat network, all right? Pen tester's dream here. And this is very, very common, all right? From a blue team, mapping internal, it's sort of like the old man, except this time you're a principal in a school. You've got students knocking on your door. You know it's one of those students. You don't know which one. You've got a better chance of detection, but again, it's a little harder. But there are some things you can look at. So I'd hope most of us run AV of some sort. AV is actually very good at detecting port scans if you look close enough and if it's configured. I'm lucky enough to work from home sometimes, and I bring my work laptop home, and I plug it into my network, and about 1 in 5 times, this little pop-up comes up and it goes, port scan, targeted attack, blocked, and I freeze. China? In reality, it's actually just my Google Chromecast going, hello! But every time it happens. So you can imagine if all of a sudden 1,000 of your hosts internally flag this alert. And this literally just happened to me on Friday. 1,000, or not 1,000, in this case 300 semantic alerts suddenly popped up. We knew something was wrong pretty quickly. So have a look at those things, because the seemingly benign alerts that some of these tools produce, if you statistically look at them, it can actually lead you to maybe finding out that someone's running an nmap inside your network. And I'm really glad that our internal red team guys aren't here, because I have that alert and they're not going to hear it. So hopefully I get away with that one for a little longer. The only thing you have to be careful of is vulnerability scanners. They'll usually trigger these alerts, but that's usually pretty easy, because hopefully you run those and you know the IP addresses of them. So that's one thing you can do for an internal scanning. But again, it's not a be-all and end-all solution. So you've mapped the network, but something's wrong. Your web shell's a bit flaky. It's only accepting 1 in 5 commands. You need to obtain another method of persistence. And a lot of nation-state actors will do this. They'll use a backup form of persistence. So in this case, we're going to go for the low-hanging fruit, the path of least resistance. We're going to find a Windows XP box. All right? We drop a PowerShell payload on there, and it's linked up to go to a dynamic DNS domain, and we just pray AV doesn't detect it. All right? And just like you saw Wayne a second ago, we wait that minute, and you get a connection. So you've got a second piece of persistence on there now. The persistence mechanism, the secondary persistence mechanism is usually a different form. So if it's a web shell, this time it'll be malware. If it was malware originally, this time it may be a web shell. It depends on what they can get, but usually it'll be in a different form. And it actually works to a blue team's favour sometimes, because it increases the detection chances of that occurring, which again I've had before. We didn't know they were in, they dropped another persistence mechanism, we alerted on that one, went, whoa, what's this over here? From a blue team, you just need to pray AV is going to work here. Raise your hands, how many people actually monitor dynamic DNS traffic? Anyone? Yeah, a couple? Good, okay. So you can block that sort of traffic, and sorry, I've just skipped a slide. You can block that sort of traffic and you can actually sinkhole it. Now, Fred in IT is going to probably want to connect to his home router to make sure Game of Thrones is downloading at the right speed. That's probably not something you should be letting through the work network. But it's something we do very successfully, and it annoys a few people, but most of the time, that sort of persistence mechanism, that sort of malware won't get out, and we, in some cases, can be alerted to it. The other thing you can do is scan persistence mechanisms. Right? So if this piece of malware is persistent, which it usually is, it'll survive a reboot, and you have some sort of EDR tool or SSEM or something that can bring all that information back, you can have a look at it statistically and go, what are the rare values of persistence? You're going to get the Nero burns and the Clippies and those sorts of things, but have a look at the rare values. They're quite good, and they pick up a lot of interesting software, mostly PUP, but every now and again you'll actually get an infection here or there. Now, I'm sorry, I did skip ahead on the DNS sinkholes. We do this very effectively. It creates a lot of noise, again. But one thing we do use it for as well is typo squatting. We internally sync a lot of typo squatting names, and the amount of misconfiguration, you wouldn't believe it. But I'd rather those email servers with a misconfigured IMAP hit our own internal boxes than resolve externally to an attacker, which a lot of the red teams and the pen testing mobs will do these days. I've seen a case where over a 5-day engagement, there was 8 gig of email traffic that went out to one typo squatted domain. And that's a lot of data. Passports, driver's license, all of it. Now, the sinkholes, when you talk to cloud, that makes it a little harder, but there are options. So you've got a second piece of persistence in there now. It's time to actually get your flag. It's time to put the nail in the coffin here. So you've found the database, you've found the server, you've used those creds that you had in your back pocket from the bash script, you've logged on and you've found it. Excuse me. It's a little big. So you need to compress it. And compressed, it comes down to 1 gig. Okay, it's still a little big. Okay. You need to get this out somehow. And you've tried your web shell, you've tried your persistence, but for some reason it's pretty slow. So what we're going to do is we're going to use RAR, we're going to split it and we're going to encrypt it with a password, and we're going to upload it to, let's say, Dropbox. We're done. So in this scenario, we've managed to capture our flag. From a blue team side of things, exfiltration is one of the hardest things to detect. But how often do you see RAR being used? The standard inbuilt Windows zip function can't split an archive. At least at last I checked, it couldn't. So usually they need to use RAR, and depending on your environment, you may have RAR installed by default. Not always the case. What you can do is actually alert on the different flags that are used to split an archive. The average user is probably not going to split an archive. The average user is probably not going to apply a password to an archive. A lot of the EDR tools and the detections out there actually look at the flags being used in these tools and the output that they're generating versus the tool itself. The tool itself changes every hour with a different MD5, it's very hard to detect. But the flags remain the same, the man page stays the same, and the output stays the same. If you're on Mimikatz on most of the latest tools, hopefully, pray, they will actually detect on the output format of the Mimikatz file itself. Because if Mimikatz runs in memory, it may not detect it, but it'll detect it when you dump all the passwords to a text file and save it as Yahoo. So you can alert on those flags, you can alert on the output. In some cases, we'd hope the cloud sharing would actually be blocked, or actually be only allowed to access to a certain few people. But what I've found is that the more and more, especially in media, the media types, they seem to need all this access. But we're in an age where we're transferring large files now, and everyone seems to need access for it. You can track large uploads. If you've got a proxy, they usually count how many bytes out you have. Problem is, Skype seems to be the worst for this. I don't know why. You have Skype sitting there and it'll do 800 megabyte in a day. And you think, are you sending files to people or are you just sitting there? So that's difficult again. Noise. Again, I'm a broken record on that one. There are so many techniques of exfiltration as well. There's DNS, there's email, there's sharing services. There's the postal system. I've heard of a case where someone has internally mailed a disk out to them.
They put it in the mailbox, the internal mailbox.
Yep, they'll put it in the internal mailbox and off it goes. And now we've just released, what terrifies me, is a 1 terabyte micro SD card. It's that damn big. You can hide that anywhere. Up under your tongue, out you go. So in this case, you just have to cover the common and just hope. Unfortunately, there is no, I've seen no tool that does all this. It's just you've got to cover the basics and hopefully you get them in another stage. So that's the red team at a high level. And they were successful. I'd say most red teams are. But the blue side really has a pretty hard job. We don't know where they're coming from. We've got a big attack surface. And it's a very hard thing. I've been on the receiving side of red team. We haven't detected them. They've gone 4 or 5 days, and lucky enough, I work for a very mature company that understands that we're always not going to catch them. But as a guy that sits there and writes the detections all day and works with a really good team, it's a bit disheartening. So it's something you have to be very careful and manage with your team, that it's okay, we'll be better next time. And I'm going to go a bit more into that, how you can achieve that. What I'm going to go into now is some of the problems that actually compound the blue team's side of things for investigation. So I've spoken to you about, I said the red team does X, blue team can do Y, we should all be able to detect everything, we should all be happy. It's not the case. You've heard me go on about this already, it's a noise problem, right? The principal in the school, he hears the kids playing soccer outside, window smash, he comes running out, which one was it? Right? It's a noise problem. It mostly affects external-facing infrastructure, but when you come to multifaceted companies, it can be quite difficult to breach through that noise. To give you an example, let's say you have an alert and it's a very VIP account, it's a service account. It's got a static password, it shouldn't fail. It shouldn't fail authentication. So if it fails authentication greater than 25 times in an hour, maybe someone's trying to break into that account. That's a sensible alert to have. Well, what happens when the password expires and no one notices? You end up having all these alerts come through your system because someone's just forgotten to change the password on the schedule. So a lot of the times when you're developing these alerts, the best intentions are there, but the business or other business factors will cause those alerts to fire. And sometimes threshold-based alerts are very hard to tweak. Thank you. And that's one area where AI actually may be used to help us here. What I've started to do is I've started to take the last 7 days of failures. And if in the last 7 days of failures it's peaked above a certain percentage, then I'll alert. Again, I still suffer the password expiration problem, but I'm baselining previous data. Because you'd be surprised how often service accounts fail. For example, some migrations from IMAP to Office 365, it tries to connect to a disabled account. Failure. My God, timestamps. Dear Lord, do some vendors get this so wrong? This is the bane of Blue Team. It's called ISO 8601. Follow it. And provide the time zone, please. The only acceptable way is year, month, day, people. Hours, minutes, seconds, time zone. My direct report's actually in Montreal, and when we first sort of became a team, there were a few issues around this because they go month, day, year because they're so close to the States. So it's now a unwritten rule. You use this format. I've seen logging vendors in general, like the Splunks and the Elks, they do a pretty good job of actually converting these timestamps into UTC and to make them parsable. But when they get it wrong, you don't notice, right? And if they mix it about, you can miss some vital information when you're investigating things. I've had one where NTP was installed, but wasn't connected to the NTP servers. The clock slipped, it started slipping, it was 4 hours out, and suddenly my logs are hitting my Splunk server and they're 4 hours out. You can imagine if I'm looking at a 30-second time window and the data's over here 4 hours earlier or 4 hours later. What I tell most of the responders, incident responders that I work with is, and the Splunk administrators hate me for this, but I say, if you're looking at 30 seconds, start at 30 days, work your way in, because there's usually some events either side of it that are actually applicable to your investigation. And the best example I have of this is load balancers. Let's, for example, say you've got a load balancer out the front and you have a web server behind it. That's two discrete set of logs. The load balancer out the front will have the IP address of the visitor, will have the user agent, all right? And then the web server internally may have the local IP address of the load balancer and the username. Let's say you need to match the internal username to the external IP address. The only way to do that without some fact that's common between the two logs is time. If you have a very heavy service that's getting used a lot, you've got to make sure those times are correct. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to find the person and find the match. The same with DNS. DNS is another story, but if the time's not right, it's a nightmare. So I've literally seen vendors just give us AM and PM with 24 hours, but no time zones. I've seen time before date. Please just follow that. Epoch time? Yeah. Well, that's a bit better. Yeah. The next thing is log formats. We have a team of 2-3 people that almost work full time just trying to make sure from our multiple vendors and multiple system owners that we can get the logs correctly. Syslog is evil. I'm sorry, it worked for us a while ago, but it's not a good format. Ceph is not bad, and JSON's pretty good. But you need to be we need to be verbose in our logs. The next big problem, and anyone with big data expertise in here will know, is normalization. Let's say that load balancer out the front, its source IP address field is src underscore IP address, underscore IP. And the web server, it's SIP. Now, if you want to create a search that looks across your entire infrastructure for an internal or just an IP address, are you going to have to remember every single log format that you've come across and you've indexed and remember all those fields? No. A lot of the good tools, your Elks, your Splunks, they'll have data normalization, data models in Splunk for that matter, and they'll condense all the different type of log formats into a common model so that all the IP addresses are named the one thing. Unfortunately, in my experience, this is fairly good, but it actually removes context out of the logs. So sometimes you'll go, I can see the IP address, where did this come from? Was it the load balancer, was it the web server? And sometimes that can be an issue. Cloud. That's all I have to say about that. No. Some of them are doing good jobs. AWS Guard Duty is not bad, and those sorts of things. Microsoft, you've got a ways to come. But there's also the outsourcing aspect, the multi-tenancy of devices. If your proxy is multi-tenanted, sometimes you cannot get logs because you'll breach privacy acts and all those sorts of things. And that's when you're signing up for your next SaaS service or whatever it may be, make sure you can get logs out of it. Make sure you can get them in real time or near real time. I have logs from proxies that are 6 hours delayed. Imagine my manager running up to me saying, we've got an outbreak of WannaCry. You'll have to wait 6 hours, sir, because I've got to wait for the logs. You know, batch logs. Microsoft currently gives us 24-hour batch logs and email and those sorts of things. It's a real problem. So a lot of the time, the blue team has to investigate with only half the picture. You know they're only getting half the picture from the red team anyway because there's always going to be a hole somewhere, but then you're only giving them half the picture at when it's happening. That's really hard to investigate. Well, we've got half the picture here. In 6 hours' time, we may be able to get another half the picture, but we've got to keep going because they're still attacking us. They're not going to stop because we're 6 hour delayed logs. Alert fatigue. This is a really, really big one. It's something I'm still battling to this day. I use the grumpy grandpa approach because that's what I am at work sometimes when this happens. It is basically you receiving the same alert over and over and over, the same time, 100 times a day, and you're like, false positive, false positive, false positive, false positive, false positive. That was false positive. Oh no, that was a true positive. Whoops. And with the baseline and how noisy it is, it's very hard. Microsoft actually said in one of their blog posts very recently, they don't actually implement any alert in production unless it has a 90% hit rate of a true positive. I wish I could say hand on heart that was my case. I'm more down 20, 30%. And especially when you're working across a big team that doesn't have the knowledge behind it and you've got an outsourced SOC, they're not going to investigate every single one. They're just going to go, no, that doesn't matter. And one thing that I've found very recently is that if your logging system, your alerting system, whatever it may be, have a way to suppress those alerts. Right? If you can quickly create a rule saying, please suppress all alerts from this host of this kind for 4 hours, that makes the blue team very happy. You may miss one, but you won't piss off your blue team. That alert fatigue can also contribute to staff turnover, which is not something any of us want. So if you hear your blue team complaining about that, it's a hard problem to solve, but it only takes to sit down and some time to tweak them. Now, I haven't mentioned a few things that compound the issues, but I'm sure you can guess some of these. Politics. I don't have domain admin over here because I'm not allowed to go over there and those sorts of things. Shadow IT. Well, that's pretty bad stuff. And the expectation that you have a deep understanding of every system on your network. If you have a big network, I mean, if you're a Facebook, you have Facebook to look after. But if you're on a engineering company, you have so many web apps that do different things, and you need to instantly, apparently, know exactly how all these logs work and how the system works. And a lot of the time, it's just spending the time on the phone talking to the service owners, who it's currently 8 p.m. on a Sunday night, and you're going to ring them up saying, how does this work? Who coded this? Where does this live? The context, I'm always on about context around vendors, around anyone. Give us some context around everything you give us, logs, whatever it may be, new projects, because that is a wealth of information we need when, excuse me, shit hits the fan. Now, I've said a fair bit of doom and gloom, right? But there is some sexiness to the blue team, let's be honest. All right? Oh, yeah, keep talking, I will. Just like Wayne with the Iron Man suit, all right? Don't meme that. I saw that, don't do that. I know where it's going, yes. I debated putting that in there. Just like Wayne with the Iron Man suit, you feel like Neo chasing Agent Smith through the Matrix when you're on the tail of these attackers. 10 minutes behind nation-state attackers, it's an amazing rush. You'll work a 12-hour day, it'll feel like 2, and it's amazing. It is really, really good. So the good comes with the bad with any job, and I've been harping on a lot about this, but it was mere to show you guys some of the compounding problems that really, when you sit back and you go, the blue team should have alerted on that, it shouldn't have been a problem. We popped this box, we installed malware, they should have seen something. There are a lot of issues at play here. Not saying we shouldn't detect it, but there's a lot of things going on. And as I say, I have literally been 10 minutes behind attackers. The 10 minutes was only because vendor X and its logging situation, just like you saw Wayne with his delay, was literally taking that time. Okay? I was analysing those logs, seeing what they were doing. I'm going to take this off the screen. I saw it just there. I was 10 minutes behind those guys, passing off the usernames and host names to a colleague of mine, and we're continuing to watch them. The one thing about, and it depends on the maturity of your company, is that if you can watch an attacker, you hopefully reveal a lot of business intelligence of what they're after. If you block an attacker, if you rebuild a machine, done, they may come in some other way. What were they here for? Were they just poking around? Were they after something specific? Were they trying to go to the negotiations or some IP intel that they wanted? There is some measure in actually watching them closely. And it depends on your infrastructure, depends on your team, whether or not you can contain that, and depends on your risk appetite as well, which is a hard one to get across the line. PowerShell injects. Attacker gets on a box, first thing they do, turn off PowerShell logs. You know you can shim the PowerShell home profile and turn that logging back on without them knowing. It's something we've done recently. It's a bit of simple code, you can just Google it. You can locally sync their C2s. This really pisses them off. It takes them a while to figure this one out. That dynamic DNS that their piece of malware was going out to, you can sync those, be it syncing on your actual sinkholes internally, right, or sync it locally. You can stump them for a little while. It may tip your hand, but you can stump them for a little while. And usually what happens is they don't look close enough, they'll switch to another C2, and it just gives you more intel. You can QoS their connection and make it like it's 1990 and dial up again. And you can run their malware on an isolated machine. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. There's a guy I work with called Matthew McGlashan, and he can talk days about this. But this gives you a lot of business intelligence. And it's a small risk, but sometimes it's worth the payoff. And that's a whole other presentation in itself. The last one that I'm very happy to stand up here and talk about is corrupting RARs. I was in a situation where exactly that. They'd come down, they brought RAR, they'd zipped up, I think it was about 4 gig of data, and it was across about 50 parts of RARs. And we were very close to them, and of course, this always happens. I go to lunch just as the alert comes up. I'm like, that's a post-lunch Ben problem. I won't deal with that now. I'll go to lunch and have an hour lunch, come back and, well, I should look at that. And here they were. They were uploading, exfiltrating part by part by part. So this is what you do in that case. You go to the second last part. You open it in a text editor, or a hex editor, whatever it may be. You take your hand, and it's called the keyboard slap, and you can just slap the keyboard. And you put random junk in that last part of the archive so that when they do exfiltrate it, they get it back, and it was a dog and now it's a cat, and they're sitting there going, why is this not working? Right? I've actually done that in an engagement. And I've seen them 12 hours later come back and go, they tried to unrar it on our side and they went, it didn't work, and they stole it again. By this time we were ready. Right? They've installed a keylogger. I've actually hex edited a keylogger to modify where the logging's going to, and I've actually logged it to somewhere I know, and I'm like, oh, that's a handy username and password to know in future. And I've actually put canary tokens in the log file they've exfiltrated, and then we've watched those come back through. If you have some controls and you have some risk appetite for this sort of stuff, it can actually generate some very good business intelligence. Now, how much time have I got? I'm over time. Wayne went over, so I'll go. A few takeaways, I'll go through very quickly. The red team, please record everything. Right? If you run 2 or 3 Nmap scams simultaneously, I'd like to know about it because it's very hard to piece that together on my side of things. Right? I know report writing for you guys sucks. Take a video, like literally screen capture your red team as you're doing it because it provides a wealth of information. Take a closer look at the signatures, as I said before, that your tools are emitting, your Nmaps and those sorts of things. Some of them are very obvious. If you want to be a bit sneakier, change them. Not against me, please. And actually consider including some detection strategies in your next report. If you've got a pen test report, you copy, paste, this, that, maybe put a detection strategy in there. For some of the more less mature companies, that's, you know, you're offering a solution. Not only do they have to patch and fix the hole, but if it ever occurs again because they've rolled some code back, you may have a way to detect it. The blue team side, just focus on the basics. DNS, authentication. Right? I've talked about some sexy tricks here, but none of those work until you get the basics right. When I first started at a company, all we had was DNS, no other logging. And that showed us a wealth of information. Right? The power of the brain, the human brain, is really good to pick out patterns. So I'll give you an example of this. A lot of the alerts I wrote last year, the year before, actually over 2017, sorry, it focused on a single alert or a single threshold. So greater than 25 hits, I'm going to alert. Now what I do is I include a report, and I'll include a graph or a report because the human brain can pick out those outliers much better than any AI can. So consider if you can't write an alert because it's too noisy, show them a rare value, show them the common values, let them decide. And if your team is, if it doesn't alert as much, your team will start to build what's normal in a baseline themselves, and you can document that going forward. So when something rare or something common does happen that shouldn't, it's an alert in itself. And in general, purple teams. I haven't mentioned that yet. Purple teams are worth their weight in gold, and I have not done a lot of those yet. And in my eyes, some people have different interpretations of purple teams. I would say a purple team is a red teamer sits there, runs an Nmap, and then gives us blue team 6 hours to figure out if we saw it, what we saw, if we can write detections around that. Next step, it's like running a red team but doing it over 6 months. And do it step by step, and during that way we can actually map out what's happening. It gives us a chance to go, we've got visibility issues here, our delayed logs aren't working, we can write some alerts. And if you're not on the pen testing, the defender, our incident response side, have a chat, if you're architecture, whatever it may be, to some of the deficiencies in logging and visibility that the blue team have. The amount of people I've talked to that are in cybersecurity and go, I didn't realise that that server's account was failing 50,000 times a day. That shouldn't be happening. Actually share some of those common issues because you'd be surprised how much they can help. And with that, hopefully I haven't destroyed your will to join the blue team. As I said, it's like Neo chasing Agent Smith, but hopefully that gave you some insight to the challenges of running incident response at large scale. Thank you very much.